"Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." The words hung in the salt-heavy air like a challenge no one had asked for. The man behind the wheel of the 10-year-old sedan did not react immediately. He did not sigh. He did not protest. He simply looked at the young shore patrol officer standing at his window, and his gray eyes were as still and as deep as the harbor visible through the chain-link fence 200 yards behind the gate. "Your credential," the officer continued, and his voice carried the particular resonance of a man performing for an audience, "is not a current format. I can't process it. Base security protocol requires me to detain any vehicle presenting non-standard identification until the matter is resolved." "Sir," he said, "sir," the way some people say pal, as punctuation, as a small, neat knife. The old man in the canvas jacket, olive green, faded at the elbows, the kind of jacket a man buys once and keeps for 20 years, reached across and opened his door. He stepped out without haste. He was in his late 60s. His hair was white and close-cropped. His hands, as they moved to secure his door, were the hands of someone who had done physical work for a very long time and had not forgotten how. He carried no briefcase, no portfolio, nothing that announced importance. He stood beside his car on the crumbling blacktop of the vehicle checkpoint lane and waited. "Pull the vehicle forward," the officer said, gesturing with the kind of authority that fills the space between someone's actual power and the power they believe they hold. "Into the secondary inspection bay." The old man drove the sedan forward. He got out again. He stood. It was a Tuesday in November. The kind of Tuesday that the base existed through rather than remembered. An overcast sky pressed down on the rooftops of the administrative buildings beyond the gate, bleaching the colors out of everything. The checkpoint itself was a modest affair. A striped barrier arm, 2 inspection booths, a small glass and cinder block gate office set back from the lane, its windows fluorescent lit against the gray morning. A flagpole, a painted speed bump. The smell of diesel from a truck that had passed through 10 minutes earlier, still hanging in the cold air. There were 3 of them. Petty Officer Second Class Renner, who had stopped the vehicle. Seaman Hollis, who stood slightly behind and to his right, pretending to review a clipboard. And Seaman Apprentice Garrett, who was watching this with the wide, careful eyes of someone in the first weeks of a new assignment, still learning what was normal here. The credential that had caused the problem lay on the inspection counter inside the booth. It was a laminated card, its format older than Renner's naval career by about 15 years. The holographic element across the top was a generation behind the current standard. The photograph showed a younger version of the man now standing in the secondary inspection bay. His hair darker then, but his eyes the same. Renner had not seen that format before. He was 26 years old and had been working gate duty at this station for 14 months. He knew the current credential system intimately. He knew the transitional format from 3 years back. He did not know this one. What Renner did not do in that moment was ask himself why a credential of that type might exist. He did not ask whether an older format might belong to someone whose access predated the current system by a considerable margin. He did not pause to consider the kind of person who might carry something that looked like that. He had seen a discrepancy. He was resolving it. He was, in his own estimation, doing his job. The old man stood in the inspection bay with his hands folded in front of him. Not clasped, not tense, simply folded, one over the other, the way a man folds his hands when he has nothing to prove and nowhere to be in a hurry. His canvas jacket had a slight pull at the left shoulder, an old accommodation for something that wasn't there anymore. His shoes were plain, dark, clean. His slacks were gray. There was nothing in his appearance that communicated rank or authority or the particular kind of gravity that ought to have made Petty Officer Renner hesitate. That was, in fact, the entire point. Rear Admiral James Calloway had been conducting unannounced inspections for the better part of 3 decades. He had arrived at stations by bus, by taxi, by borrowed bicycle on one memorable occasion. He had stood in cafeteria lines and eaten with enlisted personnel who had no idea who he was. He had sat in the back of briefings and listened to the unguarded version of what officers said when they believed the audience was their peers. He had learned more about the actual operational state of a command in 4 hours of anonymous observation than most inspection teams gathered in 4 days of formal review. He did not announce himself. He did not send advance notice. He did not arrive in a staff car with a flag on the hood. He drove his own sedan, wore his own canvas jacket, and presented his own credential, the one that had been valid for longer than most of the people at this gate had been in uniform. He was here this morning to inspect the station. He had not expected the morning to begin quite this way, but he was, if anything, a patient man. And patient men, in his experience, were rewarded with information. "You're going to need to wait in the office," Renner said. He had moved to the door of the gate office and was holding it open, the gesture just slightly too theatrical, just slightly too much of a performance. "We're going to run this and verify it. Standard procedure." "Of course," the old man said. His voice was quiet, not meek. Quiet in the way that deep water is quiet. He walked into the office. He sat down in the plastic chair beside the counter. He folded his hands in his lap and looked at the middle distance and waited. Renner came back in and picked up the credential. He held it up to the light, as though the angle might reveal something the direct view had not. He said, without looking at the old man, "I've never seen one like this." "They stopped issuing them," the old man said, "in 2009. Renner looked at him then. Something in the flatness of that statement, the absence of defensiveness, the simple offering of a fact, created a small flicker of something in the back of Renner's mind. He did not know what to do with the flicker, so he ignored it. "I'll need to log it," he said, "and run it through the system. It could take a few minutes." "Take your time," the old man said. "If you believe that true strength is measured not in volume, but in silence, not in the volume of a man's rank, or the brightness of his insignia, but in the stillness behind his eyes, type competence in the comments below." It was Seaman Hollis who made the next mistake, and it was the kind of mistake that compounds the first one rather than correcting it. Hollis was 23, and he had grown up with the particular confidence of someone who had always been slightly better at things than the people immediately around him. He had scored well on his entry assessments. He had advanced quickly to E4. He had, in the 14 months since he had been assigned to gate duty with Renner, absorbed Renner's particular brand of authority by performance, and added his own polish to it. He leaned against the counter, looking down at the old man in the plastic chair, and said, "You know, if you're not active, there are visitor credentials you're supposed to use, for civilians." He paused, just a fraction of a second too long before adding, "Sir." The old man looked at him. He did not look away. He did not respond. Hollis interpreted the silence as an invitation to continue. "It's actually a security issue," he said. "Not just for you. For everyone on this base. We can't just wave through credentials we can't verify, no matter who they're from or how old they are. That's not how it works." The base commander himself would tell you the same thing. The mention of the base commander, in that small office, in those words, spoken with that particular cadence of assured self-righteousness. The old man said nothing. Renner was at the terminal now, logging the credential number. He typed it in. He hit enter. The system processed for a moment, and then returned a result that Renner read once, and then read again, and then read a third time, with the gradual concentration of a man who is trying to find the error he must have made. There was no error. The terminal was showing him a record, an access record, a clearance record, the kind of record that, when you read the first two lines, causes a very specific physiological response in a person who suddenly understands what they have done. Renner's face changed. It did not do it all at once. It did it the way color drains from a photograph left in sunlight, gradually, with a terrible uniformity. He picked up the phone. He did not say much. He listened for a moment. He said, "Yes, sir." He hung up the phone and he looked at the old man in the canvas jacket, and he said nothing at all, because there was nothing appropriate that he could say, and every inappropriate thing was crowding the available space. Hollis had seen Renner's face. The clipboard in his hands had become very interesting to him. Seaman Apprentice Garrett, watching from the doorway, did not know precisely what had happened, but he had been in the Navy long enough to recognize the specific silence that follows a significant mistake. He stood very still. The old man waited. It took 8 minutes. 8 minutes is not a long time in most contexts. It is a long time to sit in a plastic chair in a gate office with two men who have recently discovered that they have made an error of a particular magnitude, and who are now processing that information in the way that people process the kind of information that rearranges the immediate future. Renner stood. Hollis stood. Neither of them spoke. The old man looked at the small window in the gate office and watched the flagpole. The flag was moving a little in the harbor wind. It was a restrained movement, dignified. He had always liked flags in harbor wind. Captain Leonard Marsh arrived at the gate on foot. He was in full uniform, every element of it correct and pressed, his cover squared to regulation. He was 53 years old and had been the base commander for 14 months, almost exactly as long as Renner had been working the gate, and he was walking faster than a base commander typically walks in view of his personnel, because he understood, in the way that experienced officers understand things, that the next several minutes were going to require every gram of composure he possessed. He came through the gate office door, and he looked at the man in the canvas jacket, and he stood at attention, and he said, "Admiral Calloway, sir." He said it with the precision of a man who has spent 30 years in the United States Navy and knows exactly how to deliver a salutation, and he said it with the particular additional weight of a man who is also, in the same breath, apologizing for something he did not do, but for which he is entirely responsible. The Admiral looked at him. "Leonard," he said. His voice was the same quiet instrument it had been in the plastic chair. No triumph in it, no edge, just a man addressing another man. "Sir, I apologize for the delay. I want you to know I will be personally reviewing We'll discuss it during the inspection," the Admiral said. He stood from the plastic chair and straightened his canvas jacket and picked up his credential from the counter. He looked at it for a moment, as though remembering something, and then he put it in his jacket pocket. "I've been here 9 minutes. In that 9 minutes, I have learned several things that I would not have learned had your gate personnel waved me through. Some of those things are concerning. Others are exactly what I hoped to find." He paused. "I'll need a workspace and access to your personnel rosters for the past 18 months. I'll also need the duty logs for this checkpoint, going back 60 days. "Of course, sir." The Admiral nodded once. He looked at Renner. Renner was standing at something that was attempting to be attention, but was undermined by the biological fact that his legs were not entirely cooperating with his intentions. He was pale. He was 26 years old, and he had just stood in a small room with the man who had, for the past 8 years, been one of the most senior operational naval officers in the fleet, and he had told that man that his credential was non-standard. He had told him to pull forward into the secondary inspection bay. He had left him in a plastic chair. The Admiral did not say anything to Renner. He looked at him for a moment, the way a man looks at a thing that is generating information, cataloging it. And then he turned and walked toward the base commander and said, "Walk with me, Leonard. We have a long morning." If stories like this mean something to you, you can help keep them coming through Patreon. The link is right there in the description. He walked through the gate he had been prevented from entering 9 minutes earlier. He did not look back. The barrier arm was lowered behind him. Captain Marsh followed at a half-step behind and to the right, which is where a subordinate officer walks when accompanying a senior, and the two men moved across the parking area toward the administrative block without hurrying, their voices too low to carry. Garrett watched them go. He was 18 years old, and he had been in the Navy for 4 months. He would remember this morning for the rest of his life. In the gate office, Renner and Hollis stood in a silence that had weight and texture. Hollis set the clipboard very carefully on the counter. It was the most precise thing he had done all morning. Outside, the flag moved in the harbor wind. The inspection lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Admiral James Calloway moved through the station with the quiet efficiency of a man who has conducted this ritual so many times that it has become instinct rather than procedure. He spent 12 minutes in the motor pool. He spent 23 minutes in the communications center. He spent 41 minutes in the personnel records section, reading with the particular concentration of a man who reads not for what is present, but for what is absent. He asked questions that were specific and patient, and that contained, for the officers answering them, the uncomfortable quality of being asked by someone who already knows what the answer should be, and is measuring the distance between the answer should be and the answer they are giving. He ate lunch in the enlisted mess, at a corner table, without announcement. A first-class petty officer joined him without being invited and was not turned away. They talked about the quality of the morning, about the wind off the harbor, about whether the forecast was going to hold. The petty officer left the table, at the end of the meal, with the sensation that he had spoken to someone important without being entirely sure why he felt that way. The first-class petty officer's name would appear 6 weeks later in a favorable notation in the inspection report. He would never know why. The inspection report itself was a document of 114 pages. It assessed operational readiness, personnel management, logistics efficiency, training compliance, and a range of administrative functions across the full scope of the station's activities. It was direct in its language and specific in its findings. It carried recommendations with a weight that budget allocations tended to follow. It was the document that would shape the station's operational review for the next fiscal year. 11 pages of it addressed the gate checkpoint. Not 11 pages of censure, 11 pages of analysis. The analysis was thorough and precise, and it identified, with the clarity of long experience, both the specific failures of the morning and the structural conditions that had produced them. It noted the credential verification gap in shore patrol training. It noted the absence of a protocol for credential formats predating the current issue cycle. It noted a pattern in checkpoint reporting that suggested gate personnel had developed procedural habits that diverged from written regulation in 4 specific areas. It noted these things without excess drama, because excess drama was not how effective inspection reports were written, and Admiral Calloway knew how to write an effective inspection report the way some men know how to play chess. Not because he had learned the rules recently, but because he had internalized them so completely that they had become invisible. The report was transmitted to the relevant commands 39 days after the inspection. It did not contain the names of Petty Officer Renner or Seaman Hollis in its findings section. Their names appeared in the personnel roster appendix, as required. Nothing about the way their names appeared would distinguish them from any other gate personnel on the list. This was a deliberate choice. It was not mercy, exactly. It was precision. The report addressed the system. The system was responsible for producing the behavior. The behavior of two petty officers on a Tuesday morning in November was a symptom, and effective naval leadership addressed causes. But the duty board in the gate office that evening told a different story. The notice appeared at 1700 hours, posted by Captain Marsh himself, which was unusual enough to draw attention. It was not long. It was not inflammatory. It was the kind of notice that accomplished its purpose through restraint rather than volume. It stated that gate checkpoint personnel were required to complete a credentials identification refresher course, to be conducted over the following 3 days. It stated that the refresher would include historical credential formats dating back 30 years. It stated that personnel were also expected to review the standing protocol for handling visitors of unknown affiliation, with particular attention to the section addressing how to treat any visitor with respect and professionalism, regardless of the apparent informality of their appearance or the age of their documentation. The duty board notice did not explain why. It did not need to. Word travels on a naval station the way word travels everywhere that people live and work closely together, which is to say immediately and completely and with the particular embellishment that human beings add to every story that carries a lesson worth learning. By 1900 hours, every sailor on the station who had not already heard about the morning's events had heard about them, and the version they heard was essentially accurate, which is rarer than might be expected. The story was this. A retired-looking man in a canvas jacket had been stopped at the gate. He had been put in a plastic chair. The base commander had arrived 8 minutes later and called him Admiral. That was the story. That was all it needed to be. Petty Officer Renner requested a transfer 4 months later. The request cited personal reasons and a preference for a different duty assignment. It was granted without comment, which is sometimes its own comment. He was reassigned to a shore installation in a different region, where he arrived, it was said, as a notably changed man, more careful with his assumptions, more deliberate in his assessments, more inclined to ask questions before he arrived at conclusions. Whether this was true, and whether the change persisted, is the kind of thing that time and circumstance determine. What was certain was that he carried, from that Tuesday morning forward, the specific weight of knowing what he had not seen when he should have, and knowing that the man he had not seen was the kind of man who would neither hold it against him nor forget it. Seaman Hollis left the Navy at the end of his first enlistment. He went into private security. He was thorough and professional, and he never, in the years that followed, made the mistake of judging a credential by its format, or a man by his jacket, or a Tuesday morning by how gray the sky looked coming in. Seaman Apprentice Garrett made petty officer in his 2nd year. He made chief petty officer 7 years after that. He told the story of that November morning, without identifying the people involved, but with complete fidelity to what had happened, to every sailor who rotated through his watch for the next 2 decades. He told it the way certain stories need to be told, quietly, without flourish, with respect for what it actually meant. He always ended it the same way. He always said, "You do not know who is standing at your gate." Admiral James Calloway retired from the United States Navy 3 years after that morning. His retirement ceremony was a quiet affair by the standards of officers who retire at his grade, which is to say, it was attended by several hundred people, that the color guard was precise, that the remarks were warm and specific and honest, and that there was a moment at the end, After the flag had been presented and the last speech had been given, where he stood in his dress uniform and looked at the assembled sailors and officers and said almost nothing. He thanked them for their service. He said that the Navy was as strong as the people who showed up at its gates every morning and did their jobs with integrity and care. He said that he hoped everyone present would remember that the most important thing about any post, any watch, any duty station was the assumption you brought to it. He said, assume excellence, assume integrity, assume that every person you encounter in your official capacity may be more than they appear. Assume that competence does not always arrive with fanfare. Assume that the person who looks least like they belong in the room may be the one who built the room. He said these things quietly, without performance, and then he put on his canvas jacket and walked out of the ceremony hall and drove himself home in a 10-year-old sedan. The story of the gate on the Tuesday in November, by the time of his retirement, had achieved a kind of quiet mythology on the station. It was told and retold with the particular durability of stories that are true, or true enough, and that carry a lesson that does not expire. It was told to new arrivals at gate duty as a matter of something close to formal instruction, not by policy, not by regulation, but by the simple human mechanism of people passing on knowledge that they believe matters. It was told this way: once, not long ago, a man in a canvas jacket drove up to this gate in an old sedan, and a petty officer stopped him because his credential was out of date. The petty officer made him sit in a plastic chair. 8 minutes later, the base commander arrived and called him Admiral. And that Admiral spent the next 4 hours and 11 minutes conducting the most thorough inspection this station had seen in a generation. And 11 pages of the resulting report were about this gate. That was the story. That was the whole of it. But the lesson was not about the gate. The lesson was not about credentials or formats or the particular bureaucratic misfortune of a laminated card from 2009 finding its way into the hands of a petty officer who had never seen one before. Those were details. Details are the scaffolding of a story, not its foundation. The foundation was this: the quietest man in the room is not necessarily the least consequential. The most unassuming presence is not necessarily the least powerful. The worn jacket, and the old sedan, and the folded hands, and the gray eyes, and the complete absence of visible rank, none of these things subtract from the man inside them. They are clothing, they are transportation, they are the surface of a thing that has depth. The most dangerous assumption you can make, in any professional context, is the assumption that you can determine what a person is worth by looking at what they wear. The most expensive mistake in any organization that depends on judgment is the mistake of confusing confidence with competence, or noise with authority, or the presence of visible insignia with the presence of genuine capability. Renner had not been a bad person. He had not been malicious. He had been young and certain, which is a combination that the Navy, like all institutions, produces regularly and must regularly correct. The correction was not pleasant for him, but it was not designed to destroy him. It was designed to teach him the thing he had not yet learned, that authority is not a costume, that rank is not a volume setting, that the most senior person in any room may be the one who needs to say the least. The Admiral had known this for so long that it had ceased to feel like knowledge and had become simply the way things are. He had learned it, decades earlier, from a man in his own past who had arrived unannounced and sat in a plastic chair and waited with folded hands and calm gray eyes and taught a young officer, without a single word of reprimand, that the world was deeper than its surface. He had passed the lesson on, not by design, not by intention, simply by being himself, on a Tuesday in November, with a 10-year-old sedan and a credential from 2009, and the particular patience of someone who has nothing to prove and never did. The lesson posted itself on the duty board that evening, in the restraint of a notice about credential formats, in the quietly precise language of a base commander who understood what had happened and what it meant, and how to ensure it would not happen again. The lesson was read by every sailor who came through the gate office in the following days, and it was understood, though it was never stated, that the lesson was not really about credentials. The lesson was about paying attention. The lesson was about the difference between what you see and what is there. The lesson was about the man you almost turned away at the gate, who turned out to be the man signing your evaluation. But more than that, it was about something simpler and older and more important than any of those professional calculations. It was about respect. It was about the basic and non-negotiable obligation that every person in uniform carries to treat every person at their post with the kind of dignity that a human being deserves, simply by virtue of being a human being, regardless of the jacket they are wearing, or the age of the credential they are carrying, or the decade their sedan was manufactured. Because sometimes the old man in the canvas jacket is an admiral, and sometimes he is not. Sometimes he is simply an old man. And the way you treat the old man who is not an admiral, when there is no inspection pending and no consequences visible and nothing to be gained or lost by the quality of your conduct, is the truest measure of what you actually are. That is the real inspection, the one you never know you are taking, the one where the examiner is only your own conscience, and the only grade is the one you give yourself in the private accounting of your days. The Admiral knew that. He had always known that. He drove home on that Tuesday evening in the 10-year-old sedan with the inspection documents secured in a battered leather folder on the passenger seat, and the harbor wind moving across the gray water outside the window, and the quiet of a man who has done his work and done it well and needs no one to confirm it. He was already thinking about the next one. The stories that endure on a naval station, the ones that travel across years and assignments, and the natural turnover of people who come and go with each rotation, are the ones that carry a truth that does not age. The truth at the center of this one was not new. It had been told before, in different settings, in different uniforms, on different mornings. It would be told again. But it was told here, at this gate, by these people, on this Tuesday, with this particular specificity of detail: the canvas jacket, the plastic chair, the 8 minutes, the 11 pages. And it was still being told, years later, to new arrivals who stood at their posts in the November wind and looked out at the vehicles approaching the checkpoint and understood, because someone had told them, that the most important question was never what they could see. It was what they might be missing. If you have ever stood at a gate, in any sense of the word, and decided on the basis of what you could see that you knew what you were looking at, this story is for you. Not as a reproach, as a reminder. The world is larger than its surface. The people in it are deeper than their jackets. The most important credential is not always the one that scans. For more stories where quiet competence humbles loud arrogance, subscribe to Old Bill's Tales, and if you'd like to help me keep telling them, you'll find my Patreon linked in the description below. Thank you for standing with me.